The qualitative non-statistical portion of the OAS report alleging fraud has no way of tying that evidence of fraud to the outcome of the election, and no way of indicating how the cutoff affected the election results. Forgery and missing or additional servers are not evidence of Morales losing the election, but only that fraud had occurred, potentially. Rather, saying it is statistically unlikely that Morales was able to obtain a 10% margin indicates some statistical anomaly that is unable to be explained using other means. Further, the statistical evidence is the only way that the OAS has any justifiable means of defending their statement on election night, that there is a hard-to-explain change in the trend of the vote count. If this is in fact explainable by other means, it would indicate that the OAS did not properly weigh the evidence available at the time of the cutoff. We reached out to the OAS for their data. Neither the OAS nor the researchers who performed the analysis released their data for replication until around a year later. Next slide. Here's the question that I want to cover today. The first is a large portion of the OAS report. It attempts to explain the variation in the vote count with fraud. While the statistical analysis does not explain it outright, its conclusion in all the OAS reports seem to signify the view that the results should be continuous throughout the reporting of the vote count. The second question is what margin Morales could reasonably expect to obtain on election night based on the information provided before. This includes where the remaining actors are for the number of votes to expect in those parts of the country. Next slide. The regression discontinuity. We started with a regression discontinuity analysis, which some applies to the local linear regression that was later included by the OAS. Regression discontinuity plots took up around half of the statistical portion of the original preliminary report. These graphs are useful to represent breaks in the vote count caused by an exogenous force. This is an outside force acting on the results that it causes a shock or a sudden change to the results. Including a regression discontinuity with the 84% cutoff, as seen in the first plot of CC's margin, is clearly trying to represent that the shutoff of the unofficial vote count, the TREP, as an exogenous force. This aligns with the official OAS report, which largely states that the cutoff was used to fraudulently affect the vote count. The original author of the analysis stated he is not attempting to causally state the fraud is occurring, but the accompanying information in the original OAS report and final OAS report give an entirely different story. In the best case, these are included as a method of portraying an anomaly, observations that deviate from what is expected. As I will portray later, there was no reason for the OAS to reasonably expect this, especially not in a report alleging evidence of fraud. Next slide. Here, I've included an analysis that could have easily been done on the time of drafting the original report. In this analysis, we've taken data from the most recent Bolivian census to highlight some of the assumptions embedded within the design of the original OAS report, concluding that the interruption of the vote count should be more or less continuous with the previously reported results. We set up a hypothesis to align with the OAS report. This is, other covariates associated with support for Morales cannot explain the selection of precincts into or outside of the time cutoff, demonstrating exogeneity. If this is true, then we would expect that the precincts before and after the cutoff cannot be predicted by other covariates, thus strengthening the claim that the stoppage had some effect on the outcome of the election. In this case, we chose easily available covariates taken from the Bolivian census, relating to rurality and poverty. This table reports a multi-level logistic regression where the dependent variable is whether a precinct reported the election's return before or after the cutoff. We include random effects by municipality and socio-demographic factors that might be correlated with support for the candidates and whether the locality has resources to conduct election. As we can see from the results, one can conclude that the precincts before and after the cutoff can be predicted, which would easily be a way to see whether the cutoff is exogenous or not. Next slide. Did geography affect the outcome? Another hypothesis that could have been tested relates to whether the final election results can be explained by voting patterns that emerged before the quick count halted. To answer this, we conduct a Bayesian analysis of the vote count for months. CC and third parties are calculated for all the precincts before and after the cutoff. Next slide. We run an analysis such that we sample precincts first when data is available from localities where there is insufficient data before the cutoff by precinct, and then finally by municipality in the event that that data is unavailable. We apply a weak improper prior to the rate parameter and for the randomly generated Poisson model and run 1,000 simulations. You can see the results of the simulations here. Essentially, what we are trying to show is that using the data available prior to the cutoff, one is able to see that Morales could have attained a 10% margin quite easily. Following these simulations, we sum the respective vote totals, add them to the election results, and compare the electoral margin for Morales relative to the second place winner, CC. These simulations reveal a range of the margin of victory for Morales extending from 10.2 to 10.34. No observations exist where the margin is less than 10 percentage points within our simulations. Next slide. So we did an additional analysis. To this analysis, we made a small update. First, we imposed a strict discount rate on the ballots left to be counted, only imputing on the verified ballots at the TREP ACTA. This works to produce a more conservative estimate of the final margin biased against a Moss victory. Second, we plot out the effects of the Bayesian imperfect prior as seen in the plot here. The prior of the plot is such that a percentage sizes of the imperfect prior as a relative to the geographic component of the simulations. The reason we make use of an imperfect prior is due to the lack of covariates within Bolivia that we can make use for parametric analysis. Therefore, through non-parametric sampling and simulations, we could demonstrate first that the baseline Moss-CC margin range where the prior is set to 0, and second, how a percentage change, increasing it, changes the margin. Essentially what this comes to is this. If you take just the information and where it is located, you can easily surmise that Morales would have got a 9.9 margin if there were other geographic components such as rurality, ethnicity, poverty, or education that affected vote outcome, as we previously showed some relationship between the reporting. That means that Morales could have if it reaches the size of 2%, Morales could have conservatively expected a 10-point margin. This is significant, this is significant to the point that the OAS is claiming that their estimates are, completely verified and completely done when a simple analysis is able to disprove the idea that the 10-point margin was impossible to obtain. And that's it.